I've rushed over here today to talk about racing games. There's something very thrilling about a well-done racing game, isn't there? There's nothing quite like that particular excitement in a board game. And it goes all the way back to the beginning of my board gaming life. I've been playing board games my entire life, ever since I was very, very young. And I remember that when I was a young kid, one of my very favorite games was a game called Fantasy Forest. It's one that I would play all the time with my mom and my brothers. And it was all about getting your character from the start of this winding pathway through to the wizard's castle at the end, while facing various help or dangers from fantasy critters and monsters along the way. So it was a very fun card-based racing game. And I'm already going to veer off into a bit of a sidetrack here and talk about Fantasy Forest, because there's some really fascinating facts about it. First of all, it was published in 1980 by TSR, a company that was started by Gary Gygax, who founded Dungeons and Dragons, and another guy named Don Kay, in order to publish D&D. The designer of Fantasy Forest was a fellow named Michael Gray, and as it turns out, he's a hugely important person within the board game industry. Michael was actually recruited by Gary Gygax to work at TSR, and later he would go on to become the senior director of worldwide concept acquisition for games at a little company called Hasbro. He would go on to design many games, including my very favorite childhood family game, which is a game called Shogun, or otherwise known as Samurai Swords or Ikuza, depending on which iteration of the game you're talking about. But he also designed Fortress America, Mall Madness, the very fashionable Miss Piggy card game, and many others as well. Michael Gray is still working in the gaming industry. He now works for Restoration Games, where in his profile on the website for Restoration Games it says, in short, he might be responsible for more games on more tables around the world than anyone alive today. And then one last thing about Michael Gray was this kind of funny quote I found on his Wikipedia page. It said, game reviewer Tom Vassell has called him, quote, the wisest man in all of board gaming, unquote. So it was just kind of a funny quote that I found on Wikipedia there. Anyways, enough about Fantasy Forest. From there, when I got a little bit older, one of my favorite family games was a game called Escape from Colditz, which was all about a bunch of World War II POWs who were attempting to escape from this German prison camp, where one player was playing as the German guards who was attempting to hinder the progress of the escapees, but the rest of them were trying to be the quickest to escape and get home with their POWs. Now, I did get to play it again as an adult, and it turns out that it's basically a 3+ hour game centered around roll and move as the game mechanism. Just rolling dice, moving pawns around, and it doesn't necessarily hold up super well to modern board game designs, but I loved it when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was also a game design hobbyist. I would design my own games and create all the components for them and the rules and everything else. And my best one of the bunch was actually a car racing game where I made little 3D cardboard race cars. And it was actually quite a good game. Later on, when Formula Day was released, it actually had some similar mechanisms to the game I had made as a kid. So that was kind of fun. So I've had lots of history with racing games. Let's talk about the ones that are currently my favorites. Before I dive into my top 10, I need to talk about the various types of racing games that are out there. So we have the classic get from point A to point B on a map the quickest. That's the sort of most straightforward and easiest to define racing game, and one of those types of games would be Cartagena here, a game that's been super fun to play with my kids, where you play as a group of pirates trying to escape from a prison cell and get to an island with all of your pirates before any other player does so. So that's very much a traditional racing game. You also have a type of game where there's a race happening, but you're actually just betting on the results of the race. So you're not necessarily trying to control a specific competitor in the race to be the one that wins the race. Rather, you're trying to come up with the most money by best predicting the winners of the race. So Downforce would be an example of that, and it's one that I've had a lot of fun with my older boy in particular. He's loved this game. Those are the two sort of categories of racing games that I'm going to be focusing on with my top 10 lists. However, you can sort of stretch the definition of racing games to cover other type of things. For instance, there are games where players are racing in real time to solve a puzzle or to complete a task. One example I have that I play with my kids is Brains Family, Bergen and Draken. And in this game, players are racing to complete some pathways in a tile laying format here before other players are able to do so. A couple of other examples of racing in real time would be Dutch Blitz, a classic card game where you're trying to empty your hand of cards before any other player is able to do so. Or Ubongo, where you're trying to form shapes onto a particular pattern before other players. So in that sense, you're racing against other players to complete these tasks. And then you can stretch the racing definition even further to encompass games where the goal is to be the first player to reach a certain number of points or a certain amount of money or whatever it is you're working toward. A couple of examples are Perry Roden, The Cosmic League, a two-player game where players are delivering goods. It's a pick up and deliver game, and the goal is to earn a certain amount of money before other players. Similarly, in the Great Heartland Hauling Company, this is another pick up and deliver game where your goal is to reach a certain money level before any other player does so. However, since this is more of a game end condition than an actual game mechanism, I've decided to leave out games like that. I mean, you could cover a whole broad aspect of Euro games if you wanted to include games where you're racing to achieve a certain points level, for instance. And I've also left out the real-time puzzle stuff as well and focused just on the moving from point A to point B on a map or betting on the results of an actual race that's happening. And finally, I will mention that for me to enjoy a racing game, it has to be quick and exciting. There are games such as Formula Day, or another one that I think is called Formula One Motor Racing or something along those lines, that are much more simulations where you're trying to manage various car systems like tires or brakes or an engine and taking damage in various areas and having to stop in the pits and work on various race strategies. And those type of games tend to be much slower moving and much longer to play. And some players do really enjoy the simulation aspect of those games. But for me to enjoy a racing game, it has to be fast and thrilling in order to capture my interest. Games like Formula Day I found just too plodding and long to really get into it. Although back in the day I did have Formula Day Mini, which was a more streamlined version of the game and more to my personal tastes. But anyhow, let's get into the top 10. Number 10 is a game that I actually just recently sold, and that is Pitch Car, a game where your race car is like a wooden crokinole disc that you flick along the track, and each player takes turn flicking their car one at a time, and you have to be the first one to get around a certain number of laps around the track. The reason I sold it is because I would rather play crokinole when it comes to that type of flicking game. With Pitch Car, I found that the fact that the track was made up of many different wooden sections meant that the wooden sections weren't always level with each other, and either you had to spend ages shimming the tracks with playing cards to get them all up to an equal level, or you'd have to deal with the fact that cars would hit the edges and go flying off the track every time you tried to make a good shot with them. So it was a little bit frustrating in that regard, but we did have a lot of fun with it regardless over the years. Number 9 is Winner's Circle. One of the games where you are betting on the outcome of a race. This is a very simple game by Reiner Knizia. It is really easy to get a group of players to just dive in and start playing this particular game. It has a really clever dice-based mechanism for moving the horses and a fun secret betting mechanism in order to bet on the results and make money. My number 8 game is about as pure a racing game as you can get, and this is Corridor, of which I have this little wooden travel edition. The goal of the game is very simply to get your pawn from one end of the board to the other before your opponent or opponents are able to do the same, going in the opposite direction. On your turn, you either move your pawn orthogonally one space, or you place a fence on the board that can be used offensively to block your opponent's pawn, or defensively to prevent your own pawn from becoming blocked, because you can't completely enclose impose upon and prevent it from being able to get to the opposite end of the board. You can learn to play in about a minute or two. You can play a game in about 5 or 10 minutes at most. And there's no luck involved. It's all your strategy and skill. So it's a good challenge that way. My number 7 is a game I also recently sold, and it's called Fearsome Floors, where you have a group of people who are trying to run from one end of a dungeon to the exit at the opposite corner, while an AI-controlled monster is attempting to eat up as many of the people in its path as it can get to. So it's a very clever and fun game from Freedom and Freeze that is also super simple to learn, but involves a surprising amount of tactics in order to influence the movement of the monster to move towards your opponent's characters rather than your own. I'm going to get to another Freedom and Freeze game later in the list, but at number 6 we have Expedition Northwest Passage, a game that simulates the attempts of the Franklin expedition to find a Northwest Passage. While there's a racing element to the game, it's not purely a racing game in that you do get the most points if you're the first player to get to the Northwest Passage and then the first player to get back to Greenland again. But you can totally ignore that aspect of the game and simply try to accumulate points through exploration. So while the most points are gained by racing to get to the Northwest Passage and back, it's not necessarily the only way to win the game, although I haven't necessarily tried strictly focusing on exploration to see how viable the strategy it is as opposed to the traveling and racing aspect of the game. I've always said that this game and the next game on the list are two of the Euro games that best bring out their theme. So let's go on to my number 5. Which is K2. And the racing element is even more tenuous in this particular game, because while players are attempting to get as high as they possibly can on the mountain and then get back safely without their climbers actually dying, it's more a race against the clock and a race against the available resources, particularly your oxygen levels, in order to get as high as possible on the mountain and then get back down safely again. You don't necessarily have to be the first to reach the highest point on the mountain, but I believe if 2 players reach the highest point and it turns out to be a tie in points at the end of the game, I think it is the first player to have achieved that high point is the tiebreaker. But it's a game that's all about managing that oxygen resource as opposed to the speed of getting things done quickly. Now, a game that is all about the pure speed is my other Freedom and Freeze game here, and that is Fast Flowing Forest Fellers. For years I stated that this was my favorite racing game of all time until a few others above it in the list eventually were released and bumped it out of first place. But it is a super fun, super fast-paced game of trying to race your lumberjacks down a river from the start to the end of the river. Along the way, you can shove opponents into currents that will bring the opponent's lumberjacks backwards. You can use the currents to your benefit to move faster on the river, and then there's the obstacles of the logs that you have to work around as well. It's a very easy card-based game, and one where you're very much interacting with the other players on the board as the race progresses. Moving into the top 3. At number 3, we have Camel Up, another game where you are betting on the outcomes of a race in order to earn the most money. This is the second edition of the game, which has better components and the fun backwards moving camel that can really mess up the race. But it's another one that is easy to get a small group of players into and have a lot of laughs as you see the results of the race playing out, and fortunes definitely changing over time as camels pick each other up or drop each other off or end up moving each other around in funny ways. It's definitely good for some fun and some laughs. Now my number 2, I believe, is the newest game in the list here, and that is The Quest for El Dorado. I have this and I have both of the expansions for it, and it's a game where deck building is the primary mechanism that you're using to move your explorer from the start of the map to the end of the map and being the first to reach the golden city of El Dorado. It's actually another Reiner Knizia game, and so as you would expect, it's very simple yet clever in the way it all plays out. I find the Heroes and Hexes expansion sort of take it or leave it, but the Golden Temple expansion is definitely a great addition to the base game here. And it's definitely a pure racing game, unlike my number one game, which is also a deck building based game. And that is Clank, a deck building adventure. Now, this is one where the racing is only one small component of the bigger picture. Yes, there are advantages to being the first player to exit the dungeon and thus potentially leave other players in the lurch. But at the end of the day, it's all about the points you accumulate as you spend the time in the dungeon, trying to race around as quickly as possible, grabbing as much stuff as you can, and then getting out of there before time runs out by other players exiting the game. In that sense, it's more a push your luck game than it is a pure racing game, but you do feel the pressure of the speed of having to get through as quickly as possible in order to gobble up the most treasure and points before the time runs out. And since it's my favorite game to play amongst all the games, even though it's not the most pure racing game, that's why it achieves number 1 on my top 10. Now, there are a few other games I would love to try that potentially could crack my top 10 here if I had a chance to play them. One of them is Rallyman GT, which I've heard is also a very fun game to play solo. There's also Power Ships, which is a re-implementation of Power Boats, neither of which I've had a chance to play, but apparently they have a very clever movement system with the way the dice work in those games. And then the other one that I'd love to try is the newer edition, the 2016 version of Robo Rally. The original Robo Rally I found was too long and plodding and frustrating to really enjoy, but apparently the newer edition really streamlines things and makes it easier to get through the actual race. There are several games that, while they didn't crack my top 10, I figured they were good enough to worth a mention here. And so we have Snowtails, which is another very clever card-based movement where you're trying to balance the movement of your two dogs on your dog sled in order to control your sled through the course. There's Flamme Rouge, a very simple bicycle racing game that is quite fun with a full count of 4 players. I think it's a 4-player game at maximum. There's another bicycle racing game that is called Reifenbreite, which is German for one nut but a pretty yellow shirt. And it's slightly more involved than Flamme Rouge, but it also uses clever movement and drafting of other bicycles and moving up and down hills and stuff. So it's pretty well done. There's a game called Jamaica, which I haven't played in years, but I remember being a fun pirate-themed racing game. One game that was a real brain burner was Sator Arapo Tenet Opera Rotas, which is Latin for walking is hard when there's a bottomless chasm beneath your feet. It was a game that involved manipulating various pathways and walkways to be the first to collect some books. And I was a little so-so on it because it really was quite brain-burny and not as fast-paced as I would normally like in a racing game, but it was one that intrigued me enough anyways to be willing to try it again. There's a game called Pirate Dice, which took Robo Rally and really simplified it into a kind of dice-based and very streamlined and fast-playing version that I've enjoyed playing. And then finally, like I mentioned before, there was Formula Day Mini, which I used to own way back in the day, that was a simplification of Formula Day and one that I had enjoyed in the past. So those are my favorite racing games. What are your favorite games to play that are racing themed or involve racing somehow in the game? I'd love to hear if there are any that I need to be checking out. And I want to thank Joanna, my Patreon supporter, for your support and encourage others to check out my Patreon as well. Thanks so much for watching. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. If you wouldn't mind just crushing that like button, smashing that subscribe button, and chucking the link for this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, by golly, I would appreciate that. Cheers. Would be Dutch Blade. The fact that it was made one of the game. Alright. If you're the first person to one that was a real brain burner was a game called Sator